Flute NI. Join me, Aisling Agnew, as we explore the unique world of the flute in Northern Ireland. World-renowned players, teachers and makers from a wide variety of musical backgrounds share their experiences and expertise. This episode features the legendary Irish flute maker, Hammy Hamilton. Thank you very much for chatting to me this morning. Can you tell me a wee bit about what got you started in playing the flute first of all, Hammy, and how you kind of came to be making flutes as well?
I suppose one thing, the flute making grew out of the flute playing, you know. I suppose I was sort of quite a late comer to traditional music, you know, because there was no music at all in the family or anything like that, you know. And so I suppose I always was interested in music anyway, you know, because I had learned piano and I was there was a really good choir in school that I was involved in, you know, and I was a singer long before I was a flute player. I still do a bit of that now and again, no, but when I obviously started on the tin whistle. Well, actually, I suppose when I started, I spent quite a while sort of mucking about with different instruments, you know, and eventually somebody advised me and said, look, pick one and stick to it because, you know, you're not getting anywhere. You know? So at that stage, it would have been the whistle, you know. So I did. I sort of started concentrating on the whistle, you know. And shortly after that, then as I said, I was quite a late starter. I would have been at Queen's at that stage. I suppose I was about 19, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And I used to be involved in the Folk Music Society in Queen's, right? And sort of through that, I would have fallen in with a lot of people like your uncle mm-hmm. and Andy Dixon and Dermy Diamond and Tara and all that crowd, like, you know, who were playing around the scene as Nabuchali mm-hmm. at the time. They had a sort of it wasn't really a band in the way you'd look at it nowadays, I suppose, you know what I mean? It was more or less sort of a loose association of people, and they did sort of, I don't think they did very many concerts as such. I suppose I saw them playing in Queen's a few times. So shortly after that, then I was mad to get hold of a flute, but in those days you couldn't get a flute, you know, because there were no shops, so there was nowhere you could go to buy an instrument, you know. So basically you had to get to know somebody who played the flute, who had a flute they didn't want. So I remember the very first flute I ever played really as such was Leslie Bingham gave mm-hmm. me the loan of an old boxwood and ivory flute for, I think, just for a weekend or a week or something like that, right? You know what I mean? Yeah. And I remember I was playing that for a while, right? And I get on great with it. I suppose I was lucky in the sense that I never had any difficulty blowing the flute. The first time I picked it up, I was able to play it, if you know what I mean, you know? Yeah. Which is a big advantage, I suppose you have to say, because a lot of people do struggle with getting sound and all that sort of carry on, you know? So the first flute that I got, we got word that Coltis were selling flutes in Dublin, right? And I can't think how I heard that. It might have been via Colin McConnell, actually, because at that stage I was very friendly with Ben Gunn, whose father was Tommy Gunn, and they had a B&B in Botanic Avenue. And because they were from Fermanagh, when Cahill was in Belfast, they used to call in there. And of course, Ben was playing the fiddle, and his mm-hmm. father, Tommy, was a very famous fiddle player, you know. I was also at that stage starting to hang around with Desi Wilkinson as well, right? Mm-hmm. And Desi was, like myself, was playing the whistle and was looking for a flute. So we got the word that there was flutes for sale. So we went down to Dublin, and the upshot was that we bought flute. I remember I think it was £45 at the time I paid for the flute, right? And it was what you'd call, I suppose, what we would now call a German flute. You know, it was a post-mounted sort of flute made in Saxony around 1900, maybe the late 1900s. You know, and that was my first flute, and I played away on it, and it was grand flute. Like, I mean, it did me for a good few years. You know, you couldn't get other flutes at the time, Being the sort of way I am, one of the first things I did with that flute was to take it to pieces completely, right? And discover that that in fact with a post-mounted flute, that each post, like that the posts are drilled after they're put into the flute. So you have to put each one back in exactly the same holes that you had. So it took me quite a while to get it back. But you did,
But you did.
As they say, the man who never made a mistake never made anything, So
Yeah.
I learned my lesson very quickly that time, I suppose at that stage then I started, because you had to sort of basically maintain your own flute at that stage, right?
Yeah.
Because there was nobody to do it for you, So I started doing a few things like sort of, recorking things and repadding and just, So that was how I got interested in the whole sort of flute making thing, And it had always occurred to me that, that there was a market for, at the time, actually, it was people like Paul Davis, maybe somebody that your generation certainly wouldn't be aware of, right? But
No.
he was an English flute and concertina dealer. Had at that stage basically cornered the market in flutes and concertinas, and he lived in Ireland actually for a good few years, but he used to visit a lot. That was the only sort of source that you could go to, and eventually, in fact, after about, I would have gotten that flute in about 75, I think. It was actually Mary Bergen that was working for Coltis at the time, and
Right.
It was Mary Bergen that Desi and myself bought the
Yeah.
flute from. But about, when I moved to Cork then in 76, which is another story in itself, I suppose. But in 76, 77, I think probably 78, I was doing, when I came down to Cork, I was doing an awful lot of playing. As a matter of fact, the first year that I was in Cork, I lived by busking. And, I was beginning to realize that, and I met then lots of other musicians, lots of other flute players and so on, right? And I began to realize that I was sort of I wasn't getting anywhere, musically, and
Okay.
I was wondering, was it the flute or was it me, that sort of a thing, right? So eventually I went up to visit Paul Davis in Clare and I bought a Rudolph Rose from him. And I remember at the time it cost me £150, right? Which was a lot of money at the time. But as soon as when I got that flute, then I realized that actually it was the flute and not me. And I really progressed a lot then once I got hold of that sort of decent flute,
Yeah.
And again, that's like I was still doing bits of repairs on flutes and so on, right? But I had always, as I said, I was at that stage still strongly thinking of actually trying to make flutes, right? And I went up to Belfast for a few months. I'd been doing a master's in ethnomusicology in Queen's.
Okay.
And that's how I ended up going to Cork. So,
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Like, is that what you were doing initially in Queen's?
No, my undergraduate was a science degree, was human physiology. And actually, I had intended to go on and do a PhD in that, right? But there was a man, John Blacking, who had set up, he had that, at that stage, had just become the professor of social anthropology in Queen's. And he was a very big shot in the whole world of social anthropology and particularly in ethnomusicology, right? And he set up the first masters. It might even have been in Europe, certainly the first one in the UK. And he was actually sort of actively looking for people that were involved in Irish music because he wanted to do a big thing on Irish music in the department. And then the Folk Music Society, as I was saying, I was involved in, we used to have our meetings in the anthropology department building. And so I basically I accepted the masters there before the physiology department got back and said, well, okay, you can do a PhD, and it was too late at that stage.
So it was all in the timing. Good timing.
And then I did my master's was about the session, right? It was sort of a sociological study of the session, right? And I had at that stage in Belfast, as you can imagine, like I was around 70, 76, that sort of time, right? 75, 76, like things were bad in Belfast really in those days. Like it was, I suppose looking back on it, it's sort of hard to believe. At the time we thought it was perfectly normal in one sense because we'd sort of grown up with it, like, But so I went off I went down to Cork initially for a month to compare like the session scene there with Belfast, right? And basically I'm still here. I never came back. at that stage then, Kieran Carson had become, well, he had been before I went, he was the traditional arts officer with the Northern Ireland Arts Council, and he was the flute player as well, as you know. And he offered me a sort of a feasibility study grant to see, to investigate the whole thing about making flutes, right? So with that money, and he also gave me access to the workshops in, is it St. Joseph's Training College?
St. Joseph's, yeah.
St. Joseph's, yeah. So I had access to the workshop there, right? That was organised, right? And with the assistance of Rab Cherry, you know Rab Cherry, the fiddle maker? Because in fairness now, I had some little experience of sort of woodwork, and he helped me out with, you know, a lot of the sort of machine work that I wouldn't have been used to, you know.
But you were kind of doing it yourself, basically.
Oh, I was, yeah, because there was nobody to learn from. There were a few books that were about, you know, making early musical instruments and things like that. But looking back, they were really irrelevant, you know. So I did that, and I made this flute, which was absolutely awful. But on the basis of that, then the Arts Council in the North gave me a small grant. I honestly can't remember how much. I was only a few hundred, with which I bought the initial equipment that I set up the workshop with. I came back down to Cork then, right? And in 1979, then I had moved to Coolay, because Noreen, my wife, is from Coolay. She's actually, I can almost, I put my head to one side, I can see the house she was born in. There was no work. We were working actually in a sort of a honey place, both of us at the time. And there was an opportunity then from Udaros and the girls to get a grant to set up, right? So cut a long story short, that was basically late 79. I actually got the workshop up and running, right? And I think I had if I remember rightly, I had my first flute made by the time of the Cork Folk Festival in 1979. That's normally, I think, late September, October. So that was my first flute. And basically then I've been a sort of professional flute maker since then, you know. And again, like really feeling my way along, because there was nobody else to, especially in those days when there was no internet and there was scarcely a phone. And actually, I mean, starting a workshop like that in a very rural area was difficult, you know, because the problem with flute making is a lot of the tools are not ordinary sorts of things, right? You know, and like now I make most of my own tools, right? Okay. And that's what people would have done. But at the time I didn't really know that, right? And I you know, you had to order things specially, and it took a few years, but luckily enough, I suppose the demand was there right from the start. Like I was able to make a living from it.
And the workshop that you set up then, like in 79, it's the same workshop that you still have then? You didn't move?
Not exactly, no, because there was a sort of a club, a social club in Coolay called An Bóra, right? It was sort of like a community club, right? And it was in a sort of a thatched cottage type building, right? Which was actually a modern building, if you see what I mean, but they built it in that style, right? Okay. And that had become defunct a few years before that, right? So again, I got the use of that building, and that was my first workshop, right? And then I was living then in a mobile home actually on that site at the time, right? Okay. But
tell her the poverty was unreal.
Oh yeah, Noreen says the poverty was unreal. It actually was, because this was in the 80s. I don't know what it was like in the north in the 80s, but in the Republic in the 80s, like, I mean, times were very, very difficult, like everywhere, you know. But we already had one daughter at that stage, right? And then Noreen got pregnant again, and we moved down to a house over a shop in Ballyvorna. That was handy because the shop then became my workshop. It was a good space, like, and we lived above it, you know. Yeah. And then we moved to another couple of houses, right? But as it turns out, we now live in the house next door to where the original workshop was. Nice. Which we bought about, how long ago now? 35 years ago, I suppose. So I'm in the same workshop for the last 35 years. It was only the first few years was sort of moving around a bit and so on.
Oh, that's pretty good history right there, isn't it?
Yeah. Full circle almost, you know.
And what about the flutes that you've made over the years? Like, I mean, obviously you were finding your feet and feeling your way, as you said, like, which is amazing, and they must have developed over time. Were there any major changes like that you made?
Initially I was the only person in Ireland that was doing that, right, you know. And even at that, I remember we always used to say to ourselves, you know, because in the first few years, as I said, we managed the way, like, you know what I mean? There was orders coming in and all this sort of carry on. And actually, right from the very start, I always had a waiting list, which was great. I always had somebody, you know what I mean? Like when I finished the flute, there was always somebody for it. I never had to go out and
advertise or
sell them or advertise or anything like that. And I suppose they advertised themselves in the sense that people would hear them being played and try them out. Oh, I've heard you get that, And at the time, as I said, I was I had no competitors whatsoever, Like that changed after a while. But I remember we always used to say, even the end of the second year, surely everybody that wants a flute must have one now, like, And we were sort of worried that we would flood the market. I suppose that was the stage when there was that sort of huge expansion in interest in traditional music. Like even the Willie Week was sort of small at that stage, like it wasn't, you know what I mean? And look at the way that expanded over the years. But then, of course, other people came in. So Sammy, I suppose, Sammy was working in the Folk Museum in Belfast, right? And he started off sort of doing a bit like Paul Davis he started doing a bit of dealing with instruments and flutes and so on himself.
Sure, yeah.
But later on then that he set up, I think about the mid-80s.
Okay.
Or he set up as a flute maker, Well, actually, when I started, I was going to say I was the first, but I suppose I wasn't really. The first flutes that I knew of that had been made in Ireland were made by pipe makers, typically Bruce DeVay and Eugene Lamb, who were both in Galway, who had started making keyless flutes. But I was the first to set up a workshop that was just making flutes. And Bruce DeVay then, he disappeared as a maker quite shortly after that. Eugene Lamb, of course, is still there. And he continued making flutes like all those years, if you know what I mean. And in particular, if you could ask who sort of helped me, I could almost single out Eugene,
Okay.
Eugene was incredibly generous with his knowledge. He was technically absolutely brilliant in the workshop, and like he'd tell you, show you how to do anything, or do you know what I mean? He was really, I learned an awful lot from him, actually,
And you see over the years, like if you adjusted things in your instruments, was it driven by the sound that you wanted to make, or was it because of people ordering specific things?
No, that's a good question. It was driven, I think, by the sound that I wanted to get, right? Because I suppose I was lucky in the sense that the very first flute that I made was a copy of that Ruddle that I had bought from Paul Davis,
Yeah.
And I measured that, and I got reamers made, because at that stage I wasn't able to do that myself, right? And the first flutes that I was making were copies of that Ruddle, right? And they worked very well, and people were happy with them. They had I think what a lot of initial makers didn't realize was that I think everybody went through this sort of sequence, right? That you copied something old, right? That was really good. The problem was, I suppose, for some people that their copies weren't very accurate, and therefore they didn't work particularly well, and so on. Do you know what I mean? But what you were copying, unfortunately, was like, this thing about old flutes being in sharp pitch, because like even the Ruddle, which I still have, actually, that original flute that I bought, if I want to play that at 440, I have to pull the head out like a really, really long way, right?
Okay.
It plays at 440, but it loses all its sort of bite and all its oomph when you have it out that far, right?
Yeah.
Because the way the head of the flute is cylinder and the body is conical.
Yeah.
If you pull out the slide too much, right, the proportion of cylinder to cone changes.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? And it really sort of affects that, right? What everybody did initially was simply to move the embouchure further to the left, which, if you think about it, was exactly the same thing as pulling the slide out.
Yeah.
So after a while, then the penny dropped, I think, with everybody, because at this stage now, there would have been this, you're talking about the sort of mid to late 80s, people like Wilkes in England and Pat Allwell in the States and so on would have been coming online as makers as well, right? And not so much Wilkes, because Wilkes was always very much do it exactly like Ruddle and Rose did it.
Okay.
Whereas Pat Allwell would have been more experimental and a bit like myself, wanted to make flutes that were not exact copies, right? So realised that what you had to do in order you had to design the flute around the pitch in one sense and not just copy it. So basically what you did was, instead of pulling the slide further out, you simply expanded the whole flute, almost exactly the way in which, the way you can do it on a screen nowadays with your fingers.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you do that on a screen, the thing expands proportionately, right? You know what I mean? So theoretically, that's what we did, and that then produced flutes that played very well at 440. Like, I then started to go for more the Pratt style flute than the Ruddle style. But then shortly after that, I began to sort of change quite a few things, right? So even though people still say that my flutes are sort of Pratt type flutes, right? In fact, like the bore is different, the finger holes are different, the embouchure is different, I don't see them as being Pratt type flutes really anymore,
Yeah.
I suppose you could say they're Pratt-esque,
And the changes you've made with the likes of finger holes or
Yeah.
where the embouchure hole is and stuff, like what kind of things are they?
Well, you see, the old, like the sort of flutes that we were copying would have been basically English, London-made, 8-keyed flutes, right? Which were made as orchestral instruments, right? And they were made for playing classical music, okay?
Yeah.
And the keys, as you know, give you the semitones of the scale, right? But they weren't just for doing that, right? Because the thing about cross fingerings, and the way you can get different fingerings for all sorts of different notes, right?
Yeah.
I suppose the commonest thing for trad players would be, your 2-finger down C natural. The English, like those English flutes, when played for classical music, right? The fingering was totally different to what we use. We use sort of like whistle fingering, basically. Like sequential 6-hole fingering, right? But what they did was, for example, you would play D, and then you'd open for E. You would open the E flat key. You only have the E flat closed when you're playing D.
Yeah.
And obviously C sharp and C, right? But otherwise, and the same thing was, you basically opened all the holes that could be opened as you went up, okay? And that corrected because if you play whistle fingering then on a flute like that, right? The scale is not in tune, right? Now, as it happened, that suited traditional players very well, because it gives you, when you play whistle fingering, the scale is more like just intonation as opposed to tempered scale. And that fits very well with pipes and fiddles.
So that kind of inbuilt scale that was like for the classical flute, it wasn't really as suited for playing.
No. And then you see a lot of it was designed for playing, because the classical composers, right, would have been writing a lot of flute music in the third octave.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And to play those third octave notes, because you know yourself, once you get up to high D, then E, F, G, and A are not sequential fingering anymore, because the flute doesn't overblow an octave the third time around. Using the keys, you can actually get your third octave notes much more easily and so on, right? But those fingerings are not really feasible for the traditional player, right? Not that you're playing much in the third octave anyway, but even for the tuning wise in the bottom 2 octaves, right? So basically what I did in terms of finger holes was to move the positions and sizes of them so that a whistle fingering would give you an in-tune scale. And I think, again, everybody did that. I think it was the logical thing to do.
But it must have also helped, like, the instrument project well, or
yes,
do you think that's?
That's a good point. Because if you know yourself, like if you're struggling with tuning, right, your tone is going to be affected as well. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you're trying to hold back in some notes and you're trying to push other notes, and some trad players were really good at doing that. Actually, there was a flute player in Belfast. One of the very few flute players at the time, because there were when I started off, like people talk about Belfast flute playing, but in the traditional sense, there was Desi, there was Tara, there was Frankie Kennedy, there was Big Gary Hastings came along, like not that much later, but a couple of years later. Gary was one of those people who sort of like, he just burst from the ground fully formed as a flute player, like, you know what I mean? He never seemed to have had to bother learning it. He was very talented in that sense, like, But that was the small group, really, And of the older players, there was Leslie, of course, right?
Yeah.
Who was sort of the granddaddy of them all, I suppose, really. But there was another flute player there at the time called Brian Bailey, and he would have been a good bit older than us now. Okay, not as old as Leslie was at the time, but he would have been in his. I suppose I was about 20, we'd say, at that stage. He would have been in his 40s, I would imagine. And he sort of faded away a bit. And after that, after I moved to Cork, you see, my focus was really, I don't really know what happened in Belfast. My first sort of reconnection with the Belfast thing would have been, I suppose, via Harry, because like Harry turned up one time below at the Mills for something, I can't remember what it was. It could have been one of the Eggshell Yermadine festivals here, you know. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Never heard of this fella, and I was going, wow.
Yeah.
Where did he come from, you know? But then, of course, I discovered that everybody in Belfast knew all about him, you know, that sort of way. But then what I was going to say, why I was saying about Brian Bailey, Brian Bailey had a flute, which would have been sort of typical in Wales at the time, right? It was bits of several different flutes stuck together, right, to make a flute that played, right? But he was really good. I couldn't play it in tune at all, right? But he was really good at lipping it up and down. Could play it very well, you know. So that was, you know, partly one of the things that I was trying to get around by doing redesigns, you know. And then I did a lot of work actually on embouchure design as well. Do you ever see my blog?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Did you see the last thing I did about the cast embouchure and about?
I had, yeah.
In fairness, it is very technical. Do you know what I mean? But it's a difficult thing to explain properly without getting technical.
Yeah, I know, but it is something that's changed quite a bit over the years. Like I think in Irish flutes and classical flutes, like the embouchure hole, the shape of it. Like one of my classical flutes is Chris Abel. I had 2 different head joints of his, and they're totally different shapes, you know, and you really like do make a different sound.
I met him. He used to work for a company called Brannan Brothers, you know, who were very famous flute makers.
Yeah.
I went over to the States, and I think 85, 86 possibly, I was trying to break into America, you know. I wanted to be able to sell a few flutes in America, so I went over and brought a few flutes with me and stuff. And through Eugene Lamb, actually, again, I got into as sort of a tour of the Brannan Brothers factory, which was incredible.
Oh, great, yeah.
And Chris Abel was working there at the time, right? And he was the first person to show me how they cut embouchures or how they modified embouchures, right? With a little scraping tool. And actually what amazed me was that I had thought that we'd say classic, you know, silver and gold flutes and even platinum flutes that they were making at the time. I thought it would have been almost entirely machinery work. Turns out it's almost entirely handwork, every bit, you know. And I was just blown away by the actual manual skill that's required to do those, you know. It really is incredible, like, you know.
Well, you must have broken in a way, because obviously your flutes have been played a lot in America and further afield even. Like, where would you say are Hamilton flutes getting played?
I think I had certainly over 20 countries I have been at the minute, you know, when I announced the retirement, you know. On the website, I think I made a list at that stage. I think it was it 22 or 23 countries or something like that. But, well, I mean, obviously, it would be mostly Ireland, right? You know, what I tended to happen was that if you sold a flute somewhere, you would end up like you'd get a sort of like a cluster then. Like one of the earliest flutes I sold abroad was in Sweden. And after that, I sold a load of flutes in Sweden. We had a lot of Swedish people coming here and staying with us and all that sort of carry on. Similarly, in Brittany, actually, I would have sold a lot of flutes there because even before I left Belfast, actually, I had met Jean-Michel Vaillant in Ben Gunn's flat, actually, in India Street. I can remember it very well. And he's still a very good friend of mine, actually. Through him now, he played a huge range of different flutes, right? But for years and years and years, he played my head on his flute, if you see what I mean, you know?
Yeah.
And, at one stage, actually, we had even considered in the 80s, I was even toying with the idea of moving to Brittany for a while.
Right.
We did such a lot of business there, you know?
Yeah.
And I would have liked to have just lived in a different country for a while. Like, I never did, but like between England and the UK in general, England and Scotland, like, and there would have been a lot of flutes there, obviously, as well, right?
Yeah.
And America, there would have been a lot, you know. And then, as I said, little nuggets around the place, mostly Western Europe, essentially. But then in the last 10 years there, you know, I started selling a few in Russia and in China, and in Japan, there was always a bit of a market there. Not huge, like I even did some in South America, Mexico and Brazil. It's amazing, these people, you know.
What players would you say have you worked with quite a bit? Are there any that have like played your flutes a lot?
Well, no surprising since he's a neighbour here, but Conal O'Grada has always played my flutes. There's a good few people in the last few years. Paul McGrattan would have been another one, actually. Tara had one. You know, there's a lot of people, like, you know, because once other makers started coming on the thing, you know, you really wouldn't find a whole lot of players that would be specifically using just one maker's.
Of course, yeah.
They might consider ones in different pitches. It's also very much a matter of personal preference, you know. Like a flute, that'll suit one player immensely. Another player won't be able to handle it at all, you know. So
Yeah. Would you say, like, whenever people have ordered flutes in the past from you, would some people be really specific about what they want, or would they kind of leave it up to you?
no, I think most people would. Most people would be coming to me because they would have played one of my flutes, maybe that somebody else owned, or one they got the loan off, or that sort of a thing, you know. One thing that I sort of backed away from to a large extent, because it never really works out, was you'd get people coming to you and they look for custom key work, you know. They decide that they want, you know, the keys in a different setup to the normal setup. And invariably that ends in tears. Like it's not that easy a thing to do to shift that, you know, the key system around. So but these people have an idea and they want this and they want that. So you do it, and of course it costs a lot more to do it because, you know, you're having to move out of your sort of comfort zone in one sense, like, you know.
Yeah.
And then you give them the flute, you know, and they come back and they go, yeah, but if this was just slightly longer here, and if that, you know what I mean? And I'm saying, well, it's too late now, you know. Plus then the thing is, like, number one, they have a flute that's unsaleable because nobody wants one different from the thing, right, you know?
Yeah.
And then secondly, they show it to somebody else and say, who made that? And they say, well, Hammy Hamilton made that flute. You know, that's weird looking, you know. You know, and then he's going, yeah, I got this done, but it didn't, you know. So in one sense, the sort of blame falls back on you a bit. Like, I don't really do that anymore. The only thing I do is, you know, I do a key setup for what we call pipers, which is just, that's simple enough. That's simply moving the B flat to the right one alongside the long C. And that doesn't make it, because, you know, an ordinary grip player could still play that.
Yeah.
Like, ideally, what you don't want to do is to make a flute that only one particular person can play. Mind you, I made a flute for a one-handed flute player once.
Did you?
Did.
And how did that work?
Well, it worked quite well. This was a guy called Per Talek. He was a Breton musician. He was sort of quite well known and played a lot. He played Irish music, played Breton music, and he played quite a bit of sort of experimental jazz and things like that, right? But we'd say he was essentially, he only had his right hand, but his left hand, he had like the base of his hand, right? So he played left-handed even though he only had his right hand, if you see what I mean, right?
Okay.
So he could play the top three holes of the flute, no problem, right? So I made him a key which allowed him to use his little finger to operate the F, and then his left hand was able to close the two bottom holes. The keys, then I just put them in places where he could actually touch them, you know? So
That's amazing.
if you heard him play and didn't see him, you would have no idea that he wasn't like a fully abled player.
That's incredible. What about wood over the years? Have you found it any challenge, like to access getting wood, or has it been okay?
Yes and no. It has changed quite a bit in recent years, you know. As you know, a lot of the old flutes were cocos wood. So initially that was available, okay, you know. It was expensive, but so I was using mostly African blackwood would have been the sort of standard thing that everybody was doing, because that was easily obtainable and so on. I always loved cocos wood as a wood, but eventually it got very expensive and it basically ran out. It's not commercially available anymore, even though I've had this sort of fantasy of going to Cuba and starting a cocos wood plantation. That would be an idea for the retirement.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I mean, I'd read on your blog about the waiting list and getting that all kind of finished up. But are you actually still making flutes? Like, you haven't
I'm still making the odd one. I'm doing a lot of restorations, historical restorations, you know.
Yeah.
So I have, over the years, actually, I've accumulated a fairly decent collection of old flutes. Like, I have some sort of fairly important instruments, like museum quality instruments in that collection, right? You know. So when I had finished up there, I still have about 15 flutes that need serious restoration, but which will be really great instruments when they're done up. You know what I mean?
Fantastic. Yeah.
And I sort of enjoy that. Actually, it's very good. You know.
Yeah.
And I do a bit of buying and selling as well, in the sense of, I wouldn't say that I'm dealing, but what I do tend to do is I try and buy stuff that I can sell or swap to get what I want for my collection, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Because what I'm trying to do at the moment is accumulate flutes that were ostensibly made in Dublin or in Ireland.
Oh, okay.
So instruments are stamped with names, but that's not necessarily who made them, right? The Dublin ones, it seems, were mostly made in London, but stamped with Irish addresses. Okay, but there's a maker called Dollard, and I've got a couple of his instruments, right, and they're stamped Dollard Dublin, but I know for a fact that one of them in particular was made by a very famous flute maker called Cornelius Ward in London. But what I'm trying to prove is, did the pipe makers actually make their own flutes, or were they doing the same thing? But there's so few of them around that it's really hard to, you know.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so that's the sort of thing that sort of interests me at the moment, you know.
Brilliant.
But I'm making a few keyless flutes and so on, you know. I'm hoping to do a sort of a few keyed ones as well, but I mean they're going to be few and far enough between, you know, because like getting rid of the waiting list was a great ease to me in one sense, you know, because
I was going to say, like you'd said, like at the start, you know, you were never short of orders, and so that's like 40 years of non-stop flute making. You know, it must feel kind of nice to have the pressure off in a way.
Yeah, and like the thing is that what I'm doing at the moment is that when I do have something there that I've sort of finished or whatever, right, you know. The problem is trying to figure out how to sell it, because it's so easy to get back. If you say you have like people will say, "Oh, yeah, can I book the next one?" But then you're back into a waiting list situation.
Yeah.
So I've just been selling them on eBay, things like that.
Well, it's good that you're keeping your hand in anyway, even if you're.
Well, I am, and I'm sort of working on a sort of a design, a completely new design of a flute, right? Which we'd say internally will be like basically the same, because what I'm still doing, I'm still sort of upgrading people's flutes, you know, because people would have bought a keyless one and then want to add keys. So what you do is you take back the keyless body, make a keyed body, which means I'm then left with a keyless body, and I make a new head for that. I sell those on. So that's the sort of thing I'm doing at the minute, right?
Yeah.
This will be essentially, I'm very happy with those keyed ones, right? And with this new embouchure that I'm doing, right? You know, it's a really vibrant, really easily filled. It's fantastic. Well, I think it is. Yeah. So what I'm doing is sort of reorganizing the key work. There's going to be no joints in this flute. This is breaking news, by the way. We're getting an exclusive. The idea would be, you know, the way on a wooden bone flute that the head fits into the body.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's the tuning slide. I mean, there's no barrel as such as there is on a wooden flute. So it'll be on that basis. There'll still be a cone bore flute and so on, right? And the key work, the foot will be integral with the body. Okay, so it'll be a bit longer than normal, right? So the only joint in the whole thing is just that. And then the key work will be on two straps, you know what I mean by straps, like on a bone flute, that are screwed onto the body on each side, right? Which means that not only that, but you can make that in a keyless form.
Yes.
Right, and then very easily to the same flute actually add the keys. You know?
That makes sense.
So that's the plan.
Well, I hope it works out. It sounds great.
If I can find the time.
Yeah.
I've been busy since I retired, you know. So there's a whole lot of things. I was in the middle of all sorts of sort of fluty research things that have been stopped now, you know, because I wanted to go to Dublin and do a bit of research actually about those Dublin makers.
Well, there's plenty still to do then.
There's loads still to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much for telling me all about that, Hammy. I so appreciate your time and sharing all of the stories with me as well. And obviously the new exclusive is exciting too. But like, I mean, you just seem to be such a force of nature with the flute. Like you don't ever stop, and you do so much. It's so interesting to chat to you about it all. So I really appreciate that. Join me next time when I'll be speaking to the upcoming classical flute player and conductor, Andrew Douglas.